Every second, 1,000,000 souls scream in agony across the galaxy, and that's considered a quiet day in the Imperium of Man. But when the screaming stops, when every psyker on a fortress world falls silent at the exact same moment, that's when you know something truly terrible is about to happen. Fortress world Vindahl Prime had stood for 3,000 years, its orbital batteries and void shields a silent guardian over the Cadian Gate's eastern approaches. If you're new to these tales of darkness and defiance, smash that subscribe button. The Emperor protects those who support the channel, and you'll want to witness what happens when faith faces the unfathomable. Captain Helena Vaskir of the 709th Cadian Shock Troops had seen 17 campaigns before her 30th birthday. She knew the smell of promethium and blood. It's the weight of a lasgun after a 14-hour firefight, the sound of artillery creating temporary daylight in a trench night. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was the sound of sudden, absolute silence in a command center that had hummed with vox chatter for 30 centuries. The astropathic choir chamber went dark at 0347 hours, fortress time. 17 sanctioned psykers, their lives spent channeling messages across the stars, simply stopped transmitting. Not gradually, not with warning klaxons or emergency protocols. One moment, Tech Priest Domeric was routing a priority message to the sector fleet. The next, his servo skull couriers returned with footage that would be classified and burned within the hour. The astropaths hadn't died. That would have been a mercy. They were laughing. Vaskir stood in the blast-scarred corridor outside the choir chamber, her command squad arrayed behind her. Sergeant Kraus held the breaching charges, his weathered face betraying nothing, but she saw his trigger finger trembling. Good. Fear meant you were still sane. The blast door before them was psychically sealed. Adamantium and faith meant to contain the dangerous minds within. Something was scratching on the other side. Not pounding, not screaming, scratching, methodical, patient, like something had all the time in the world. "Captain," her Vox operator, Trooper Yellen, whispered. "I'm picking up sounds from inside. They're speaking." "Speaking what, Trooper?" Yellen's face had gone gray. "Everything. Every language in the Imperial lexicon. Simultaneously. And some that aren't in any database." The laughter had stopped 6 minutes ago. The scratching had begun 4 minutes ago. And now, the temperature in the corridor was dropping despite the fortress's climate controls registering normal. Vaskir could see her breath misting in the air. Her soldiers could see it too. She'd fought orcs in the ash wastes of Varos. She'd held the line against tyrannid swarms that blotted out the sky. But those were enemies she could understand, enemies that bled, that could be killed with enough firepower and faith. This was different. The fortress's master of astropaths, Hierophant Sardis, had served for 43 years. He was a stable, controlled psyker, his third eye bound with blessed chains, his mind armored with prayers and psychic wards installed by the Inquisition itself. If he had fallen to whatever lurked beyond that door, then conventional protocols were already obsolete. "Domeric!" Vaskir voxed to the tech priest monitoring from the security station. "What are your sensors reading inside the chamber?" Static answered her. Then, through the crackling, "Impossible readings, Captain. 17 life signs, but thermal imaging shows the chamber at -40 degrees. Atmospheric composition indicates trace elements that don't exist on the periodic table. And the Geller field generators are screaming alerts. Says there's warp presence inside the fortress itself." That last part made Vaskir's blood freeze colder than the corridor air. Geller fields kept demons out of real space. They were shipboard technology designed to create bubbles of reality in the nightmare of warp travel. Yet the fortress had them as backup systems, redundancy for the astropathic chambers. If they were detecting warp incursion here, on a fortress world in the material universe, thousands of light years from the nearest warp storm. The scratching stopped. In the silence that followed, Vaskir heard something worse than any scream. A child's voice, singing a lullaby in perfect high Gothic. The words were innocent, a prayer song taught to every Imperial child. But the voice that sang it held harmonics that shouldn't come from a human throat, notes that seemed to bypass her ears and carve directly into her mind. "Orders, Captain?" Kraus asked, his voice steady despite the horror in his eyes. Helena Vaskir had been trained to make decisions under fire, to calculate odds, to know when to advance and when to withdraw. In every instinct she possessed, screamed at her to seal this corridor, vent it to space, and call for inquisitorial support. But 17 Imperial servants were behind that door, 17 souls sworn to the Emperor's service. She primed her plasma pistol and nodded to Kraus. "Breach it." The breaching charges detonated with a crack that echoed through adamantium bones of the fortress, but the blast door didn't simply collapse. It peeled open like a flower blooming in reverse, the metal twisting in ways that violated basic physics. The edges didn't glow from heat. They wept. Actual tears of moisture ran down adamantium that had withstood orbital bombardment. Vaskir's squad entered in standard breach formation, lasguns raised, targeters sweeping the darkness. The astropathic chamber should have been lit by sanctified candles and the soft glow of cogitator screens. Instead, their helmet lamps cut through absolute blackness that seemed to resist illumination, their beams dying meters shorter than regulation specifications allowed. The 17 astropaths sat in their psychic cradles exactly where they should be, cable jacks connecting their neural ports to the fortress's communication array. Not one had moved, but their heads were all turned toward the entrance, tracking the squad's movement with eyes that had been ritually blinded decades ago, yet somehow saw perfectly now. Those empty sockets leaked light, not the golden radiance of the Astronomicon, but something that shifted between colors that had no names, hues that made Vaskir's vision blur and her stomach clench. "Throne of Terra," Kraus whispered, his lasgun wavering. Hierophant Sardis sat in the central cradle, his chains of office hanging slack. The psychic wards that should have been glowing with protective power were tarnished black, frost crystallizing across bronze that had been sanctified on Holy Terra itself. When he spoke, his voice carried 17 different timbres, as if all the astropaths were speaking through his mouth simultaneously. "Captain Vaskir, Helena, daughter of Marcus Vaskir, who died at Cadia holding the 14th gate. You carry his dog tag still, against regulation, tucked inside your left boot." No one knew that. No one living. "In the Emperor's name, identify yourself," Vaskir commanded, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Command presence was everything. Show fear, and fear would consume you. The thing wearing Sardis's face smiled, and the smile was geometrically wrong, too wide, with too many angles. "We are the breach. We are the crack in the wall between what is and what hungers to be. We are the whisper that has been calling for 3,000 years. And finally, you have answered." Trooper Yellen made a choking sound. Her auspex was shrieking warnings, and the display showing readings that couldn't be real. Atmospheric pressure fluctuating wildly, localized gravity wells appearing and disappearing, background radiation spiking to lethal levels, yet their dosimeters registered normal. "The veil is so thin here," all 17 astropaths said in unison, their voices layering into a chorus that made reality shudder. "You built your fortress on a wound. The Cadian Gate is breaking, and the screaming will soon begin in earnest. We are merely the first to slip through the cracks." Vaskir's training warred with her instinct. The Cadian Gate, that region of space where reality was already strained thin by ancient wars and the Eye of Terror's proximity. If something was using the astropaths as anchors, as doorways, she squeezed the trigger. The plasma bolt hit Sardis' center mass, a superheated matter burning at temperatures that could vaporize ceramite. The Hierophant's body didn't vaporize. The plasma wrapped around him like a cloak, drawn into those bleeding light eyes, absorbed into whatever was coiled inside his flesh. "Iron and fire," the chorus laughed. "Always iron and fire. You are children playing with your father's weapons, not understanding that the house is already burning." Then the corruption revealed itself fully. The cables connecting the astropaths to the communication array weren't just transmitting anymore, they were transforming. Brass and meat intertwined as reality rewrote itself according to laws that predated the Imperium, predated humanity. The psychic cradles cracked open like eggs, and what emerged was still recognizably the astropaths. But wrong in ways that made Vaskir's enhanced soldier conditioning scream warnings. Flesh ran like wax and reformed harder than steel. Bones broke and reknit in architectures that allowed impossible movement. And through it all, the astropaths kept smiling with too many teeth. "Fall back!" Vaskir ordered, her command voice cutting through the horror. "Seal the chamber! Authorization Vaskir Omega 77!" Her squad retreated in good order, laser guns firing not at targets, but to provide covering fire, to maintain discipline in the face of the incomprehensible. They were Cadians, born and bred for war, but this wasn't war. This was the universe itself becoming sick. The blast doors, damaged by the breach charges, struggled to close. Through the shrinking gap, Vaskir saw the astropaths rising from their cradles, and not with the uncertain movements of the blind, but with predatory grace. Behind them, the air was splitting, actual cracks appearing in reality like a window struck by a stone. Through those cracks, she saw colors that hurt to perceive, geometries that bent in directions that didn't exist, and something vast stirring in the space between spaces. The doors sealed with a grinding crash of adamantium on adamantium. In the silence that followed, Vaskir heard scratching begin again. But this time, it was spreading, up the walls, across the ceiling, down through the fortress's infrastructure like an infection. Her vox crackled. "Captain Vaskir, this is command. We're receiving reports of incidents throughout the fortress, personnel acting strangely, weapons malfunctioning in specific patterns, and the Geller fields." Static consumed the transmission, but not before she heard screaming in the background. 17 astropaths had been corrupted. But how many thousands of souls lived in Fortress Vindahl Prime? How many minds were now exposed to whatever was clawing its way through from the other side? Sergeant Krauss looked at her with eyes that held the same terrible knowledge. "It's not contained, is it, Captain?" "No, Sergeant," Vaskir said quietly. "I don't think it ever was." Somewhere deep in the fortress, something that sounded like children laughing echoed through the Vox system, and the lights began to flicker in patterns that resembled a heartbeat. The fortress died in stages over the next 6 hours, bleeding from 1,000 invisible wounds. Vaskir commandeered the Tactical Operations Center on Sub-Level 9, one of 3 hardened command posts designed to operate independently if the fortress was decapitated. Her reduced command staff, those she could verify as uncorrupted, worked with mechanical efficiency, trying to map an infection that followed no logical pattern. "Section 7 Gamma, unresponsive," reported Lieutenant Macris, his face illuminated by flickering hololithic displays. "That's the 3rd armory in the western quarter. Security picked feeds show the doors sealed from inside, but thermal scans read, Captain, they read 97 personnel inside a space rated for 20. "Impossible," Tech Priest Domeric interjected, and his mechadendrites working frantically across multiple cogitator interfaces. "Physical matter cannot compress beyond—" He stopped, his organic eye widening. "Unless spatial dimensions are being manipulated. Localized reality distortion consistent with warp incursion protocols. Vaskir studied the tactical display. Red icons marked corrupted or unresponsive sections. Amber showed contested areas. Green zones were shrinking by the minute. Isolated pockets of resistance in a fortress that had become a labyrinth of horrors. The pattern was strategic, cutting off command structures, isolating loyal forces, severing communication lines. Whatever was orchestrating this understood Imperial military doctrine better than most generals. "Ma'am," Yellen said, her voice tight, "astropathic chamber sensors just spiked. Energy readings are off the scale. And the cracks in reality, they're widening." The hololithic display shifted, showing the chamber where this nightmare began. The 17 astropaths stood in a circle now, their transformed bodies carved with symbols that predated human language. The air between them rippled like heat haze, but the temperature readings showed absolute zero at the epicenter. Reality was tearing, and something massive was pushing through from the other side. "Time until full breach?" Vaskir demanded. Domeric's calculations scrolled across multiple screens. "At current rate of expansion, 11 minutes. But Captain, these readings suggest the entity attempting manifestation is not merely demonic. The power signature matches forbidden archives from the Horus Heresy. This is a demon prince, a being that was once mortal, but ascended through the dark god's favor." The temperature in the command center dropped 5 degrees. "Explain what that means, priest," Vaskir ordered, though part of her already knew. Every Cadian child learned the stories. Every soldier who'd stood at the gate had seen what chaos could birth from broken souls and shattered faith. "A demon is a fragment of warp stuff given form," Domaric said clinically, though his human hand was trembling. "Dangerous, but bound by the laws of their nature. A demon prince is different. They retain mortal cunning combined with immortal power. They can think, plan, corrupt. They are generals of the ruinous powers, and when one manifests fully in real space..." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Still with us in the darkness? You hit that like button if this tale chills your soul, because what comes next will test the limits of faith and firepower. The fortress shuddered, not from weapons fire or explosion, but as if the entire structure had taken a breath. Gravity fluctuated for 3 heartbeats, sending unsecured equipment floating before crashing back down. The lights didn't just flicker, they changed color, cycling through spectrums that made Vaskir's eyes water. "Manifestation in 7 minutes, Domaric reported. "The veil is collapsing." Vaskir made her decision with the cold calculation that had kept her alive through 17 campaigns. "Macris, get me a Vox channel to every loyal section. I don't care if you have to hardwire it through the emergency systems." "Channel open, Captain." She took a breath, gathering the authority that came from blood and duty. When she spoke, her voice carried to every uncorrupted soldier in the fortress, every man and woman who still served the Emperor in truth. "This is Captain Helena Vaskir, acting fortress commander. 6 hours ago, something from the warp breached our astropathic chambers. It has spread through our home like a disease, corrupting the weak and consuming the unprepared. In approximately 7 minutes, a demon prince will complete its manifestation in real space." She paused, letting that sink in. No point in softening it. "We cannot allow that to happen. A demon prince fully manifested on a fortress world is an extinction-level event, not just for us, but for every system in this sector. The entity will use Vindahl Prime as an anchor point to tear the veil wide, all creating a permanent warp rift. Billions will die. Trillions across surrounding systems when the rift expands." Through the Vox, she heard the silence of soldiers processing their death sentence. "I'm not ordering a last stand. I'm ordering an execution. We are going to kill this thing before it finishes crawling into our reality. Tech Priest Domaric has a plan that might work, but it requires faith, fire, and every loyal soul willing to face the abyss." "Captain," A voice crackled through the Vox, Sergeant Major Drevin from the Eastern Batteries. "The Emperor protects. What are your orders?" Vaskir allowed herself the ghost of a smile. Cadians didn't surrender. Cadians didn't run. Cadians held the line. Converge on the astropathic chamber. Bring flamers, melta-charges, and every sacred icon you can carry. We're going to give this demon a welcome it won't forget. She cut the Vox and turned to Domeric. "Your plan better work, priest. It violates 17 protocols and may constitute tech heresy," Domeric replied. "But the fortress's Geller field generators can be overloaded to create a localized reality bubble, essentially force the demon back through the veil before it fully manifests. However, the energy discharge will be catastrophic. Anyone within 300 meters of the chamber will be vaporized. How many of us do you need to reach the generators and set the charges?" "A small team. 5, perhaps 6. Vaskir nodded slowly, the weight of command settling on her shoulders like armor plate. "Then 5 it is. Volunteers only." The fortress screamed. Not through Vox systems or alarms, but through the walls themselves. A metal shrieked as if in agony, the sound carrying harmonics that made Vaskir's bones ache. Every screen in the command center erupted with the same image, the astropathic chamber where reality had finally torn completely open. The demon was coming through. It was vast, even half-manifested. Too large for the chamber, yet somehow contained within it, as if space itself was being rewritten to accommodate its presence. Wings that were once flesh, and now something transcendent unfurled in dimensions human eyes weren't meant to perceive. Armor that had been ceramite in a forgotten age now burned with corruptive fire that needed no oxygen. And its face. Emperor preserved them. Its face still held traces of mortality. This had been a space marine once, one of the Emperor's finest. And before pride and ambition had damned it to eternal servitude to the dark gods. When it spoke, every corrupted soul in the fortress spoke with it, a choir of the damned. "I am Varketh the Ascended, Prince of the Crimson Tide, Herald of Khorne's eternal war. 3,000 years I have clawed at this world's foundations. 3,000 years I have whispered in dreams and bled through cracks. And now, at last, the veil parts, and I am real." The demon's manifestation accelerated. 4 minutes until full materialization. Vaskir grabbed her plasma pistol and looked at her command staff. "Who's coming with me?" Every hand went up. They moved through corridors that were no longer entirely real. Vaskir's strike team, herself, Domeric, Kraus, Yellen, and Makris, advanced in tight formation through sections of the fortress that geometry had forgotten. Walls met at angles that added up to more than 360 degrees. Doorways led to rooms that shouldn't exist in the fortress's architecture. Gravity wavered, making each step uncertain, forcing them to mag-lock their boots to decking that felt organic beneath their feet. The corrupted didn't attack them. That would have been a mercy. Instead, they watched. Former comrades lined the corridors, their bodies twisted into new configurations, flesh merged with bulkheads and machinery. A gunner Vaskir had shared drinks with last month stood fused to his autocannon, the weapon growing from his arms like grotesque branches. His eyes tracked their movement, and his mouth shaped words in a language that predated human speech. "Don't look at them," Vaskir commanded. "Eyes forward. The Emperor protects." "The Emperor protects," her team echoed, the litany a lifeline in the madness. Domeric's auspex guided them through maintenance tunnels and service shafts, avoiding the main thoroughfares where reality had collapsed completely. His mechadendrites carried the melta charges, 12 packages of concentrated destruction, each one blessed by the fortress's now dead chaplain. The Geller field generators were 2 levels below the astropathic chamber, buried in the fortress's deep infrastructure. If they could reach them, if they could activate the overload sequence, if Domeric's calculations were correct, and the reality bubble would force the demon back through the veil before it fully manifested. Too many ifs, But ifs were all they had. The vox crackled with Dreven's voice, distorted but recognizable. "Captain, we're in position outside the chamber. First wave reporting 37 effectives, mixed arms. We're holding for your signal. But this thing is almost through." Through the static, Vaskir heard the background sounds. Laser guns firing on full auto, the roar of flamers purging corrupted flesh, men and women screaming prayers and defiance. The main force was buying them time with blood. "Understood, Sergeant Major. Hold that line. We're almost there." Almost was optimistic. They were 300 meters from the generators when Yellen's auspex shrieked a warning. "Contact! No multiple signatures converging on our position." They came from ahead and behind, shambling things that had been maintenance crew and fortress staff. The corruption had transformed them into living weapons. One man's arms had become bone blades that dripped acidic ichor. A woman's torso had split open to reveal a maw lined with teeth that should have belonged to something deep ocean and prehistoric. They moved with terrible purpose, guided by a singular will. Vaskir's plasma pistol barked, superheated matter coursing through corrupted flesh. Kraus and Macris laid down suppressing fire, their laser guns set to maximum output. Yellen lobbed a frag grenade that detonated in a cluster of the twisted, buying them seconds. But seconds weren't enough. More came, always more. The fortress had held 12,000 souls before the breach. Even if only a fraction had been corrupted, those were odds that math and ammunition couldn't overcome. "Domeric, how much further?" Vaskir shouted over the weapon's fire. 70 meters! But Captain, the concentration of warp energy is intensifying. The demon is actively trying to prevent us from reaching the generators. It knows what we're attempting. Of course it did. A demon prince wasn't some mindless beast. It had been a tactical genius in life, commanding armies across star systems. It would recognize a threat when it saw one. The corridor ahead rippled, space folding like paper, and suddenly they weren't in a maintenance tunnel anymore. They stood in a vast cathedral of brass and bone, the ceiling lost in roiling clouds of crimson smoke. The air tasted of copper and burning hair. "Illusion," Domeric stated flatly, and his augmented senses cutting through the deception. "Psychic projection. The physical space remains unchanged. Follow my transponder signal." But illusion or not, the cathedral held occupants. Figures in the smoke, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing armor that Vaskir recognized with a chill that went soul-deep. Astartes patterned ceramite, but corrupted, twisted, bearing the 8-pointed star of chaos. Demon-bound space marines. The demon prince's honor guard, manifesting alongside their lord. "Emperor's mercy," Macris breathed. "The Emperor's mercy is a bullet and a clean death," Vaskir snapped. "Move! Double time!" They ran. Not a retreat, Cadians didn't retreat, but a fighting advance toward an objective. Last bolts carved through the phantom warriors, and while the shots passed through some like smoke, another sparked off corrupted ceramite with terrifying solidity. The line between real and unreal was blurring. Kraus went down with a cry, a blade that was more concept than matter carving through his flak armor. Macris grabbed him, hauling the sergeant up even as blood streamed from a wound that seemed to shift position every time Vaskir looked at it. "Leave me!" Kraus gasped. "Complete the mission!" "Shut up and keep moving, Sergeant," Vaskir ordered, putting herself between her wounded man and the pursuing horrors. Her plasma pistol was running hot, the warning runes glowing amber. One more shot and it would need to cycle down or risk catastrophic overload. She fired anyway, the bolt striking a demon marine center mass and detonating in a miniature sun that vaporized everything within 3 meters. The pistol's machine spirit screamed warnings and died, the weapon fusing into an inert lump of slag in her hand. They burst through a doorway that Domeric's mechadendrites had forced open, and reality snapped back like a released rubber band. The cathedral vanished. They were in the generator chamber, A vast space filled with humming Geller field machinery, each unit the size of a Chimera transport. The blessed technology that kept reality stable, that held the warp at bay. And standing between them and the generators were the 17 astropaths, their bodies now fully transformed into something that wore flesh like a costume. Behind them, through the chamber's transparent ceiling, the astropathic chamber was visible, and within it, Varketh the Ascended completed his manifestation. The demon prince stood 4 meters tall, a wing spread, armor burning with unholy fire. Where he stepped, the decking didn't melt. It transformed, becoming brass and bone. Reality rewrote itself in his presence, the material universe bending to accommodate a being that shouldn't exist within it. Comment your theories below. What corruption stalks our heroes? Because faith alone won't be enough for what comes next. 2 minutes to full manifestation, Domaric reported, already moving toward the nearest generator with his melta charges. After that, the reality anchors will stabilize and nothing we do will force him back. The transformed astropaths moved to intercept, their mouths opening in unison to release a psychic scream that bypassed armor and flesh to assault the soul directly. Yellen dropped her laser gun, hands clawing at her helmet, blood streaming from her nose and ears. Vaskir pulled an object from her webbing, the one thing she'd carried through 17 campaigns against all regulation. Her father's Cadian prayer beads, each one carved from stone taken from the original fortifications of Cadia itself. Worthless to anyone else, priceless to her. She held them up like a shield and spoke the words her father had taught her before the 14th gate had claimed him. My armor is contempt. My shield is disgust. My sword is hatred. In the Emperor's name, let none survive. The prayer beads flared with light. Not warp light or demon fire, but the simple, pure radiance of faith. It wasn't psychic power. It wasn't sorcery. It was the belief of billions of souls across thousands of years, crystallized into a moment of absolute conviction. The astropaths recoiled as if struck. See, plant those charges, Vaskir roared, advancing with nothing but faith and a dead plasma pistol. Her team moved. Kraus, bleeding from a wound that existed in multiple dimensions, hauled himself to a generator and began affixing melta charges. Makris covered him, laser gun barking in controlled bursts. Yellen, recovered from the psychic assault, worked on the second generator with Domaric. The transformed astropaths came at Vaskir in a wave of twisted flesh and impossible angles. She met them with the prayer beads wrapped around her fist, each impact flaring with that simple, terrible light. They were stronger than her, faster than her, empowered by energies that could unmake reality. But she was Cadian, and Cadians held the line. She fought with the desperate fury of someone who knew she was already dead, and that the only question was how many she could take with her. Her father's beads shattered against corrupted flesh, each fragment burning like a star, and when the last bead broke, she used her fists, her boots, her teeth if necessary. Behind her, she heard Domaric's mechanical voice. Charges set. 30 seconds to detonation. We need to evacuate the blast radius. 300 meters. They'd never make it. Vaskir looked at her team, Kraus barely standing, Makris supporting him, Yellen and Domaric already moving toward the exit. Good soldiers. Good people. They deserved to see tomorrow. Above them, through the transparent ceiling, Varketh turned his burning gaze downward and recognized the threat too late. Go, Vaskir shouted. That's an order. I'll hold them. Captain, Kraus started. The Emperor protects, Sergeant. Now run. Or I'll have you shot for insubordination. They ran. She heard their boots pounding away, heard them shouting her name, heard the desperation in voices that had faced death 1,000 times, but had never abandoned one of their own. The astropaths closed in around her, and Vaskir stood alone in the center of the generator chamber, holding her line with nothing but flesh and faith against the tide of the damned. The charges detonated with light that was almost holy. The Geller field generators didn't explode. They screamed. 12 Melta charges detonating simultaneously created temperatures that could boil ceramite, but Domarik's modifications had redirected that energy into the generators themselves, overloading systems designed to create bubbles of reality in the warp. The result was a cascade failure that inverted their function, creating not a shield against unreality, but a hammer of pure, undiluted truth. Reality itself became a weapon. The wave expanded from the generator chamber at the speed of thought, a sphere of absolute material law that rejected everything the warp had written over the past 6 hours. Corrupted flesh unwove back into base matter. Impossible geometries collapsed into Euclidean normalcy. The very air shrieked as it was forcibly reminded of the laws of physics. Vaskir had 3 seconds of consciousness before the wave hit her. She used them to smile. Then reality crashed over her like a tidal wave of fire and light, and she knew nothing at all. Captain Helena Vaskir woke to the smell of medici alcohol and reclaimed air. Her body was a symphony of pain, each nerve-ending reporting damage with clinical precision. Burns covered 40% of her body. 3 ribs were cracked. Her left arm was gone below the elbow, the stump wrapped in regenerative bandages that itched with the fury of accelerated healing. But she was alive. Emperor's throne. She's awake, someone said. Macris, his voice rough with exhaustion and relief. She tried to speak, but her throat was raw. A straw appeared at her lips. Yellen, her face bruised but whole, helping her sip water that tasted like the finest wine. Oh, the demon? Vaskir finally managed to croak. Back in the warp, Tech Priest Domarik answered, his mechadendrites working over a data slate covered in analysis scrolls. The reality pulse forced Varketh back through the veil before he could stabilize his manifestation, the breach sealed, the corruption mostly purged. Mostly. That word carried weight. Casualties. The silence that followed told her everything. Macris finally spoke, his voice flat with the tone of a man who had counted too many bodies. 12,000 Fortress personnel, 4,817 confirmed dead. 3,200 transformed beyond recovery. We had to purge them. Mercy killings, where possible. The rest are in medici quarantine. Some may recover, most won't. Half the fortress, half their people, gone in 6 hours. Hey, Sergeant Kraus, she asked, though part of her already knew. Died getting us out, Yellen said quietly. The wound he took from the demon blade, it was never really in real space, couldn't be healed. He lasted long enough to see us reach minimum safe distance, then she didn't finish. Vaskir closed her eyes, adding another name to the list of debts she owed the dead. Marcus Vaskir, Sergeant Kraus, 4,816 others who had held the line when reality itself was the enemy. The generator chamber? Vaporized, Domarik said, along with everything within 273 meters. The blast should have killed you. You were at ground zero. But the prayer beads you carried, Captain, this will sound like tech heresy, but the fragments created a localized faith shield. A microscopic reality anchors that held just enough space stable to preserve your life. I've never seen anything like it in all my years of service. Her father's beads. The last piece of him she'd carried. Gone now, transformed into the miracle that saved her life. She didn't know whether to laugh or weep, so she did neither, maintaining the mask of command even from a medici slab. The astropaths? 17 piles of ash, Macris reported. Whatever they were at the end, the reality pulse reduced them to component atoms. Clean deaths, Emperor's mercy. And the fortress? Operational at 62% capacity, Domarik said, his tone almost proud. The Omnissiah's blessing upon the machine spirit that endured such trauma. Orbital defenses are online. Void shields functional. We can still defend this position. The Cadian Gate holds. The Cadian Gate holds. Those words had been a prayer for 3,000 years, a promise written in blood and faith across 100 worlds. Vindahl Prime had nearly fallen, nearly become the crack that shattered the wall. But it stood, battered, broken, bleeding, but standing. Inquisitorial response? Vaskir asked, knowing that an event like this would draw the Emperor's watchdogs like sharks to blood. Inquisitor Covenant of the Ordo Malleus arrived 4 hours ago, Macris said carefully. She's been very thorough in her investigation, interrogating survivors, examining the blast site. She's asked to speak with you when you're conscious. Of course she had. An Inquisitor would want to know how a mere captain had survived ground zero of a reality bomb, how she'd resisted demonic corruption long enough to complete the mission. They would ask questions with threats behind them, looking for any taint, any trace of the warp's touch. Let them look. Vaskir had faced a demon prince and lived. She could face an Inquisitor's scrutiny. "Help me up," she ordered. "Captain, you need rest." Yellen started. "I need to see the fortress. I need to see what we saved. Help me up, trooper. That's an order." They helped her into a wheelchair, her body too damaged to walk. Macris pushed her through corridors that bore the scars of the battle. Scorch marks where flamers had purged corruption. Las burns on bulkheads where desperate firefights had raged. Entire sections still sealed and marked with purity seals where the taint hadn't fully cleared. But there were also signs of recovery. A work crews repairing damaged systems, medical teams triaging the wounded, soldiers at their posts, standing watch, maintaining the eternal vigilance that was the Imperium's only true defense against the dark. They passed the memorial wall where names were already being etched, 4,817 souls, each one given the honor they deserved. Vaskir saw Krause's name there, saw her father's name from years past, saw the names of people she'd served with, laughed with, bled with. "They held the line," she said quietly. "They held the line," her team echoed. At the observation deck, Macris positioned her wheelchair before the massive armored viewport. Beyond it, the void stretched eternal and cold, studded with stars that had burned for billions of years and would burn for billions more. And Fortress Vindahl Prime hung in that darkness, a moat of defiance against the infinite. And far in the distance, barely visible even with augmented sensors, the eye of terror pulsed with malevolent light. The wound in reality where chaos bled through, where demon princes and worse things waited for any weakness, any crack in the wall. "It never ends, does it?" Yellen asked. "The war, the watch, the dying." "No," Vaskir said. "It doesn't. There are 10,000 ways to die in the 41st millennium, but only one way to truly live, standing between the darkness and those who cannot stand for themselves. That's what we do. That's what we've always done." She thought of Varketh the Ascended, forced back into the warp but not destroyed. He would return someday, with another plan, another attack, another attempt to breach the veil. And when he did, there would be other soldiers standing ready, other Cadians holding the line with faith and fire. The Emperor's light burned eternal across the Imperium, carried in the hearts of billions who would never know the battles fought in their name, the horrors faced so they could live another day. It burned in fortress walls and prayer beads, in the sacrifice of good soldiers and the defiance of those who refused to yield. It burned even here, in the darkness between stars, where something was always watching, always waiting, always hungry. But as long as there were soldiers willing to stand, willing to bleed, willing to hold the line with nothing but flesh and faith against the tide of madness, the light would never go out. "The Emperor protects," Captain Helena Vaskir said, staring into the void. "The Emperor protects," her soldiers answered. And on Fortress Vindahl Prime, as on a million worlds across the Imperium, the watch continued.